Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed on a very rainy and grey London morning. My name's Adam, and today we are going to look at the 11 studio albums by classic English rock band The Who. I didn't even have to put this on, I was wearing it already today. The Who formed in Shepherd's Bush in northwest London in 1964 when Roger Daltrey wanted to put a band together. He was a singer and a guitar player. He got together with Keith Moon, the drummer, and John Entwistle, the bass player, and Pete Townsend, who is obviously a songwriter and guitarist. They went on to make 8 records with that lineup, setting a new standard in hell-raising along the way, which resulted in Keith Moon dying in 1978. Then they got Kenny Jones from the Small Faces in to replace him. He played on a couple of records. And then there was a long gap, and they carried on gigging, but John Entwistle died in 2002. Classic rock star's death. You may want to look it up. The remaining 2 members, Pete and Rog, still play live to this day as The Who, and in fact are working on a new album as I speak. But let's get straight into it. So at number 11 from 1981, their 9th album, Face Dances. This was their first album with Kenny Jones, and I have to say it's a pretty underwhelming record. There isn't a great deal to recommend it. It was a hit. It went top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic, mainly because of the brilliant single You Better You Bet, which is by far and away the best thing on this record. I don't think there's anything else on here that can lay a claim to having a place in a list of great Who songs. So it's very easy one to put right at the bottom of this list. And number 10 from 1966, their second album, a quick one. So this is the first example of Pete Townshend's ambition, because the first side of this record is more or less a sort of traditional album of the time. You know, you've got a cover and you've got some filler stuff on there, and then the second side is really a mini rock opera, a quick one while he's away. The songs on this album, some of them are pretty good. So Sad About Us has been covered by Primal Scream and The Jam, amongst others. Boris the Spider is something of a sort of a Who deep cut. I mean, it's a quirky album. Happy Jack was put on other subsequent versions of this album, which made the top 40. It's quirky, but I have to say it's not one I listen to that much. Number 9 from 2006, the latest record they've recorded, Endless Wire. Now I feel a bit bad putting this one higher than some of the others because it's actually only just Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey. And it's a long record. There's 19 songs on this record, but again the second side is a mini rock opera called Glass and Wire, which has sort of lots of 1 and 2 minute songs. Some of them utterly forgettable, some of them utterly beautiful, notably Trilby's Piano, which is a lovely piece of music. I think there's some really good songs on here. It's a shame they were never able to record them with the classic lineup, because I think songs like We've Got a Hit and Mirador and Mike Post's Theme are really, really good songs. You could argue this could have been condensed into a really good sort of short record, but I think that's really missing the point of Pete Townshend's muse and songwriting. I don't think he'd appreciate a comment like that at all. So if you're watching, Pete, ignore it. I'm sure you are. At number 8, from 1982, their 10th album, It's Hard. This was their second album with Kenny Jones. Now, Roger Daltrey's gone on record as saying he didn't like this record and didn't want it released. I don't see that. I think there's some really good stuff on this record. I think Athena's really nice. It's Hard is really, really tuneful. It's got Eminence Front on it, which was a cracking song that they played live for many years with this lovely sort of epic driving riff going all the way through. It may not be a great Who album, but it's not a bad album, and I think that's as good a summation of It's Hard as you can have. From number 7 from 1967, The Who Sell Out. So this was The Who's contribution to the psychedelic summer of love, and of course it's a crazy concept album. You have to admire the front and ambition of Pete Townsend. You really do. This was an album about based around commercial jingles for commercials and public service announcements. The big hit on this album was I Can See for Miles. Unfortunately, the album's been butchered a lot with re-releases, and songs have been taken off and put on it, so you're never quite sure where you are or which version you have of the record. It's wonderfully quirky, it's weird. For me, it's dated a little bit, so it's not one I go back to that much. NumberSix from 1978, their 8th album, Who Are You? This was Keith Moon's last album with the band, and rather creepily, on the cover he is sitting on a chair turned around, and on the back of the chair is written "Not to be taken away." Well, sadly, 3 weeks after this album came out, he was taken away and he died. This album came out 3 years after the one that preceded it, and I think in those 3 years the band had drifted apart quite a lot, and by all accounts recording was quite stressful. Keith Moon was not in a good way. Roger Daltrey had problems with his voice, and also Pete Townshend was always very aware of the Who's place in music and his place in the strata as a songwriter, and you can hear him struggling with the advent of disco music and punk and new wave and all of those things. You've got Music Must Change, Goodbye Sister Disco, Guitar and Pen. These are all pretty good songs with pretty good hooks, but there's something a bit fragmented about it all. The playing isn't as loose and dynamic as we've heard in the past, and also there's some synthesizers on here that just don't sit within the Who's music, as we've heard synths sit in their music before, and we'll talk about that in just a second. From number 5 from 1965, My Generation. This is the Who's debut album, and typical of a lot of bands' debut albums of the time. It consists of a couple of cracking songs, some supporting songs, and some covers, notably a couple of James Brown songs and a Bo Diddley song. Most famous, of course, for the absolutely iconic title track, My Generation, which I'm sure you know, which you can either regard as an anthem for a young generation or an anthem for an aging generation desperate to cling on to their youth. Also, The Kids Are Alright, which is one of my absolute favourite Who songs. But what really strikes you about this album is the sound of it. This is the sound of 4 bolshy, pugilistic lads making music. You've got distorted guitars and a rumbling bass and thundering drums, and then you've got Roger's kind of brutish vocal over the top. That's what you're left with when you listen to this record. It doesn't swing like the Beatles swing, and it's not sexy like the Rolling Stones, but you can certainly go back and add this record into that little sort of germinating pot of music that became hard rock and punk. You know, there's a few records around this time, and you can see the seeds of all that there. Number 4 from 1975, The Who by Numbers. This was their 7th album. I really like this album. It came out and it wasn't really critically acclaimed when it came out. I think people thought it was a bit of a disappointment after some of the stuff that had gone before. But I think it's got a lovely warm sound to it, and I think Pete Townshend's songwriting is a bit more personal and introverted on this record. There's a beautiful track called Blue, Red and Grey, which is just lovely. It's also got Dreaming from the Waist, Slip Kid, Squeeze Box, which is perhaps not that mature. It was a big hit and it's a bit naughty, but it was a great song anyway. But I do like this record a lot more than I think the critics did at the time, and I think it's one of those records that is slowly being reevaluated over time. Number 3 from 1973, their 6th album, Quadrophenia. Quadrophenia, of course, was another big full-blown rock opera from the sort of ambitious mind of Pete Townshend. This one telling the story about a mod Jimmy who kind of loses his way in society a little bit, and in a desperate attempt to become an individual, he becomes part of a mod gang and ends up being just another one of the Numbers. The Who knew they had something ambitious on their hands here, so they built a studio in Battersea to record this in. And it's a dense record. There's a lot in there. It's almost progressive at times. There's some great moments. You've got Love Reign Over Me, Bellboy, The Real Me, 515. You know, some of these songs, what's so wonderful about Pete Townshend, I think he has a real ability to tap into basic human emotions in such an honest way, in such an unschmaltzy way. Listen to something like Love Reign Over Me. It sets him apart, I think, from so many of the other songwriters, contemporary songwriters at the time. He's so much more honest and human with his songwriting, but there's a real intelligence there as well, I think. Very successfully, of course, revived the mod movement when the film came out a few years later. And that was also very, very highly critically acclaimed. It's a great movie. Check it out if you've never seen it. Number two from 1969, their fourth album, Tommy. This was Pete Townshend's first fully blown rock opera, and this tells the story of the deaf, dumb and blind boy Tommy, who becomes a spiritual leader to a malfunctioning society. Pete Townshend had his own spiritual leader, the Meher Baba, and he wanted to incorporate a lot of the Meher Baba's teachings into his music, and he devised Tommy as a good vehicle to do that with. He also wanted to play longer pieces of music live, sort of suites and medleys. He wanted that to set them apart from the Beatles and the Stones, people like that. And this is most famous, I think, for Pinball Wizard, the sort of the Who classic. But I think there are so many bits of music on this that work. All the little sort of vignettes and the short pieces of music, they're moving from one to another. Tommy, Can You Hear Me? We're Not Gonna Take It, I'm Free. It's full of brilliant bits of music, and the playing is fabulous. It's so creative and musical, but dynamic as well at the same time. You put this on and you're constantly hearing new things that all the players are doing. And I've been listening to this album all my life practically, and I still put it on and marvel at some of the stuff that's going on. So I think absolutely one of the Who's best albums. Some people put Quadrophenia above this. I put this above Quadrophenia because I think it's more melodic. That's the thing. As you probably know me by now, I love melody, and I won't keep going on about it. But number one, my favourite Who album from 1971, their fifth album, is Who's Next. Now, by 1971, the Who had kind of lost their mod audience. The mods weren't really around anymore. But Pete Townshend, again, very aware of how the Who needed to move on and change with the landscape. They were now having to compete with Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple bands like that. So they needed to develop a harder sound, and this does have a harder sound. Who's Next? They were absolutely now at the top table of rock bands. They'd done Woodstock and Monterey and stuff like that. And this record, I think, is the perfect distillation of everything that's great about the Who. The playing is just off the scale. It's thunderously exciting. Just listen to Pete Townshend's crashing guitars and John Entwistle's brilliant bass runs. Roger Daltrey's screams in Won't Get Fooled Again. And Keith Moon's drums. I think this album has one of the greatest introductions any album's ever had. You've got Pete Townshend's innovative use of the ARP synthesizer at the start of Barbara O'Reilly, and then the thundering piano chords, and then in comes Keith Moon, and then the whole thing just takes off as a wonderful rock epic. The synthesizer is used again to great effect in Won't Get Fooled Again towards the end of the album. But there's also Bargain, Behind Blue Eyes. It's full of songs which are really, really famous and well known amongst rock fans. I don't think there's really a bad song on the record at all. As I say, all the band is absolutely on top form, and I think it rightly deserves its place at the top of my list of Who albums. So there you go, my list of Who albums, reviewed and ranked for your pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure you don't agree. If not, then say so in the comments below. But I will be back again very soon with another Rock Records Reviewed. Thanks. Bye-bye.